what made you at least curious about Christianity?
Well, I sure wasn't curious in college or in my graduate studies in quantum mechanics. I was an agnostic bordering on an atheist. If somebody tried to talk to me about something that couldn't be measured by science, I would say you're just wasting your time and mine.
I've had conversations like that.
Yes, I was a committed worshiper at the altar of science. I worshipped scientism, which basically is the prior assumption that there's nothing worth considering that can't be measured. So if that's your prior, then you're going to have to be an atheist. And it never occurred to me that wasn't a prior that could necessarily be defended at that point. It just seemed like, well, that's what everybody who's a scientist must think, and so I do too. I had occasional glimpses, Andrew, of moments that seemed to be hard to explain, some sort of spiritual glimmerings, often inspired by music or something beautiful, or some calling of what it means to be a moral human being and not quite understanding where does that come from. But I was pretty quick to dismiss those. So I entered medical school as an atheist and avoided those Christian medical students who always seemed to want to have lunch and made sure that I was always busy because I did really want to hear what they had to say. It made me uneasy. I liked not being responsible to anything outside of myself and some relationships, sure, but not God. No, I didn't want that kind of prying eye, especially because I didn't see why I should have to accept that.
So what?
What happened?
What happened?
Well, there is this thing of life and death, and how do you deal with those big questions, which I had managed to avoid pretty effectively until, as a third-year medical student, suddenly you're out there in the hospital wards, sitting at the bedside of good, honorable people who are dying and for whom our medical interventions are probably going to fail. And you have to look at that situation and ask yourself, how would I feel? What would I say? Would I think my life had been well spent if I was in that bed? And I couldn't help but notice that a lot of these folks in North Carolina had more confidence in their faith than they did in my medical ministrations. And that seemed like a pretty powerful psychological crutch, which I assumed it was, but it was still intriguing. And there was a moment, one of those moments where, in your life you can see the room, you can see where the person was, where you were, maybe even what curtains were on the wall, and a question gets asked to you. And it was a patient of mine, an elderly woman with really bad heart disease, who had been very open sharing her faith with me as we were failing to help her very much. And she had a bad episode of chest pain, and as she sort of recovered, she shared her faith again. And I was embarrassed. I didn't know what to say. I was standing there. And she finally turned to me and said, Doc, I've shared my faith with you a couple of times, but you never say anything. What do you believe? Nobody had ever asked me that. People listening to this, if somebody asked you that right now, what do you believe? Would you know what to say? I did not know what to say. And suddenly, my atheist perspective seemed very thin, unsupported by any real hard work of discerning why that was the answer. It was so clear all at once that I had ignored this most important of all questions because I didn't want to deal with it. And she'd called me out. And I stammered.
It's funny how life and death, one of the things I think that we sort of don't appreciate much these days is that we've pushed death and dying so far away from us that we don't see it at all. Previous generations of humans saw it all the time.
Yes.
And so we have deliberately created a world in which we've even managed to create a world where those questions are pushed away from us all the time. Mm-hmm. And we consume ourselves with distractions to avoid that. So we've actually created society to prevent these kind of moments happening.
Indeed, and I'd been benefited, if you call it that, from that same kind of protection from those questions until then.
Well,
and then
me too. I mean, when I had to confront all my friends dying in their 20s and early 30s
with HIV/AIDS,
that's a real, and then one's own, finally one is going to. Well, I'm going to die soon too, probably. It concentrates the mind.
Yes, it does.
You have to answer the question, what the hell am I doing here?
Right.
The question that I kept asking myself does my beloved friend Patrick's life, which ended at the age of 31, mean less than me who's now approaching 62? No.
No.
Absolutely. I had to. That's a hard one.
That's a hard one. And she basically, approaching the end of her life, provided this kind of surrogacy for me to imagine myself in that role, which I had never really done.
But then you picked up books and you started reading about Christianity.
I figured I better do my homework here.